My son smiled when he handed me the envelope. Too wide, too rehearsed. The kind of smile people practice in mirrors when they're about to do something unforgivable and want applause for it. "Dad, you've done enough," he said. "You deserve peace. A cruise. Son, see rest. Let us take care of things for a while." I was 68, widowed, and tired in a way sleep never fixed. I had built everything we stood on brick by brick, deal by deal after his mother died. I believed exhaustion when it wore the costume of love. I hugged him, thanked him, and boarded the ship with a suitcase full of linen shirts and a heart trying to forgive the years he'd been distant. It wasn't until the second night, when I tried to check in online for the return flight, that the truth slid under the door like a knife. There was no return flight. I went to the concierge. Polite smile. Keyboard clicks. Apology delivered like a receipt. "Sir, your ticket is one way." I called my son. Straight to voicemail. I called my daughter-in-law. The line went dead. I told myself it was a mistake, a glitch, something fixable in the morning. That night, the ocean was calm and endless, and for the first time since my wife's funeral, I felt truly afraid. By the third day, the locks on my phone began to change. Banking access denied. Credit cards declined. My email password rejected me like a stranger. I stood on the deck, wind tearing at my collar, and finally understood the elegance of what they'd done. They hadn't pushed me out. They'd floated me away. When I returned to port weeks later, I didn't go home. I couldn't. The house was no longer mine, quietly transferred, sold, and downsized into something tasteful I had never seen. My car had been donated. My name had been removed from the company I founded, the one I signed over years ago, because family should never feel like business. I rented a room near the docks and learned how to live small. I sold my watch. I worked nights at a marina office, answering radios, logging arrivals, watching sons arrive with fathers and fathers depart alone. I learned which kindnesses were real. I learned how quickly people disappear when you stop being useful. And I learned patience, because before I boarded that ship, I had done one thing my son never knew about. Years earlier, when the company grew fast and lawsuits sniffed around success, I created a contingency trust, old-fashioned, boring, and invisible. It didn't hold the company. It held the leverage, patents, supplier agreements, the quiet clauses that made expansion possible and failure very expensive. I never told my son because he hated anything that wasn't shiny. He wanted titles, not infrastructure. The trust required one thing to activate proof of coercion or abandonment by next of kin. I had plenty. It took time. Paperwork always does. I gathered emails that stopped mid-sentence. Call logs, bank denials, the one-way ticket receipt, the notarized statement from the cruise line confirming I had never been offered a return option. I sent everything to a lawyer whose father I once helped when no one else would. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded and said, "I remember." 3 months passed. Then the calls began. First my daughter-in-law, voice shaking, suddenly sweet. "Dad, there's been a misunderstanding. We didn't mean—" I hung up. Then my son, crying. Actually crying. He said my name the way he used to when he was 5 and scared of the dark. He said the company was collapsing. Suppliers were pulling out. Partners were suing. Accounts were frozen. He said he didn't know how this happened. I listened. Silence can be very educational. They begged me to come back. Said they needed me. Said family was family. Said mistakes were made. I told them I was on another cruise. They flew to me instead. Found me thinner, calmer, wearing clothes without logos. My son knelt. Actually knelt. In a marina office that smelled like salt and oil, he grabbed my hands and said he was sorry. He said he'd give everything back. I told him I didn't want everything back. I wanted the truth. He admitted it all. The planning. The jokes about how long I'd last. The relief of having space. The assumption I'd fade quietly somewhere warm and never cause trouble again. I stood up, helped him to his feet, and handed him a folder. Inside were the documents that transferred operational control, not to me, but to the trust. A trust that paid dividends to me and funded scholarships, employee pensions, and a foundation in my wife's name. A trust that barred him from executive power for 10 years and required mandatory oversight. "You wanted me gone," I said gently, "so I'm gone. From your way, they lost the house they stole. I let them keep a smaller one, far from the city, because cruelty teaches nothing. Accountability does. I didn't return to the old office. I bought a modest place by the water and volunteered at the marina. I ate dinner with people who knew my name without needing my signature. Sometimes my son writes. His letters are careful now. Honest, mostly. He signs them the way he used to when he was young. Love survived. Control did not. And every once in a while, When the sea is flat and the horizon looks like a promise instead of a threat, I smile and remember the one-way ticket that taught me exactly who I was without anything to give, and how dangerous that made me. He didn't push me out of his life in one loud, dramatic moment. He erased me carefully, the way people erase pencil marks they're ashamed of, slow, neat, and meant to leave no trace. When my son told me he had booked me a cruise to help me relax, his voice was full of concern, the kind that sounds sincere because it's been rehearsed. He spoke about my health, my loneliness, how much stress I had carried since his mother died. He said he wanted me to enjoy what I had earned. I wanted to believe him, because believing your own child is easier than accepting that love can be weaponized. The day he handed me the ticket, he hugged me longer than usual. I remember noticing how tense his shoulders were, how his hand patted my back instead of resting there. At the time, I thought it was guilt for spending too much money on me. Now I know it was something else entirely. He was afraid I might look too closely. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, but I didn't open it until I was already at the port, surrounded by laughing couples and families taking photos. I didn't check the return date, because who checks the return date when their own son has planned everything? The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces, each one sharper than the last. First, the airline app refused to show a return flight. Then my bank app asked me to verify information I had used for years, only to lock me out completely. When I called home, the phone rang endlessly, like a voice echoing in an empty house. Standing on the deck that night, watching the lights of the city disappear, I felt something break that I didn't know could break anymore. It wasn't anger. It was the understanding that I had been judged unnecessary. He had done it neatly. While I was at sea, my access to money vanished. Bills went unpaid in my name, not because I forgot, but because I was never meant to pay them again. The house I lived in for decades was listed, staged, and sold without my signature being questioned. Because years ago I had trusted him enough to make things easier. I had told myself it was love. It was convenience for him. By the time I returned to land, my life had been packed into boxes I would never open. What hurt most was not the loss of comfort, but the intention behind it. This wasn't an argument that went too far or a moment of cruelty spoken in anger. This was planning. This was sitting at a table, deciding that a father had outlived his usefulness. That realization changes how you see every memory. Every smile becomes suspect. Every, "Don't worry, Dad," becomes a closing door. I slept in cheap rooms near the port at first, places where the walls were thin and the sheets smelled like bleach. I sold things I once believed would stay with me until the end: my watch, my cufflinks, the pen my wife gave me on our anniversary. Each sale felt like cutting away a piece of the man I used to be. Yet in that stripping away, something unexpected happened. I became invisible, and in that invisibility, I became free to see clearly. I replayed conversations in my mind, not to torture myself, but to understand where love had ended and calculation had begun. I saw how often he had rushed me, how eager he was to handle boring paperwork, how quickly he shut down questions. I understood then that sending me away wasn't an act of mercy. It was a strategy, a clean solution to an inconvenient parent. The sea had taken many things from me, but it also gave me time, long, silent days where there was nothing to distract me from the truth. I realized that the real cruelty wasn't the one-way ticket. It was the assumption behind it, that once removed from comfort and power, I would simply disappear, that I would be too weak, too old, too broken to matter. That assumption was his first mistake, because even as he stripped me of access and comfort, he couldn't strip me of memory, experience, or the quiet instincts built over a lifetime of surviving worse than betrayal. And while he thought he had sent me away to fade, he had actually given me the distance I needed to see him clearly. For the first time, not as my son, but as a man capable of abandoning his own father if it benefited him. That understanding hurt more than hunger, more than cold nights and locked accounts. But it also hardened into something unmovable. When a person realizes they have already lost everything, fear loses its grip. And when fear is gone, patience becomes a weapon. When I finally stepped off the ship and felt solid ground beneath my feet, I expected relief. Instead, I felt disoriented, like a man waking up in a stranger's body. The world I returned to looked familiar, but it no longer recognized me. My phone buzzed with error messages instead of welcomes. My bank cards, once dependable, were suddenly useless pieces of plastic. Even my email, my link to contracts, memories, and people treated me like an intruder. That was when the truth settled in. I hadn't just been sent away. I had been erased. I went to the house first, driven by instinct more than hope. The key didn't work. The locks were new, polished, final. Through the window, I saw different furniture, staged lighting, no trace of the life I had lived there. A real estate sign leaned casually against the lawn, the kind that suggests progress and fresh beginnings. I stood there longer than I should have, holding a key that meant nothing now, and realized I didn't even know where my own things were. The house wasn't stolen in a moment of chaos. It had been removed from me with paperwork and signatures I had once trusted someone else to manage. That night, I slept on a bench near the port, my suitcase under my head like a child clinging to a toy. The sounds of the city carried on without noticing me, cars passing, laughter drifting from restaurants, music playing for people who still belonged somewhere. I understood then what it meant to fall out of the world without dying. No one was looking for me. No one expected me home. The man who had built a life had been replaced by a man with nowhere to go. Survival became my first lesson. I learned which cafes didn't ask questions if you sat too long with a single cup of coffee. I learned which faces to avoid and which eyes held quiet kindness. I took a night job at the marina, logging arrivals and answering radios, work that paid little but asked even less. There is a strange humility in doing work that doesn't care who you used to be. At first, it burned. Then it healed something I didn't know was wounded. The loss of identity was sharper than hunger. People didn't know my name, my history, or what I had once commanded with a phone call. They saw an older man with tired eyes and cheap shoes, and they treated me accordingly. Some ignored me. Some pitied me. A few spoke to me like an equal, and those moments mattered more than they should have. I began to understand how much of respect is rented, not earned, and how quickly it's reclaimed when the payment stops. At night, exhaustion would drag me into sleep, but memory refused to rest. I replayed my son's words over and over, searching for cracks I had missed. I remembered how confidently he said, "We'll take care of everything." At the time, it sounded like love. Now it echoed like a verdict. The realization that my own child had planned my disappearance was a grief deeper than death. Because death at least admits loss. This was denial. This was pretending I had never mattered. Yet something unexpected happened in that forced simplicity. Stripped of status and routine, I began to listen to people, to silence, to myself. I watched other abandoned men drift through the docks, each with their own quiet story of being left behind by families or systems that no longer needed them. I saw how easily the world discards those who stop producing. In them I saw my future and I refused it. I started writing things down, dates, names, moments that felt wrong in hindsight. The bank denial on the third day at sea, the unanswered calls, the sudden sale notice on my house. At first, it was just an attempt to stay sane, to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it all. Slowly, without me fully realizing it, it became something else. A record, evidence, a way of turning pain into structure. Losing everything forced me to look at my life without illusions. I saw how much I had trusted convenience over clarity, love over verification. I saw how I had confused silence for harmony and delegated responsibility to someone who wanted control, not stewardship. These realizations were humiliating, but they were also empowering. You can't correct a mistake you refuse to see. By the end of the third month, I was thinner, quieter, and sharper. I no longer reached for my phone expecting kindness. I no longer waited for apologies that would never come. I had accepted the truth of my situation, and in that acceptance, something solid formed. I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was observing it. Being reduced to nothing taught me exactly how much I still had. My mind still worked. My patience was intact. My understanding of systems, legal, financial, human, had not disappeared just because my name had been removed from accounts. My son believed he had won by taking everything visible. He never considered the damage that invisibility could do to someone who knew how the world really functioned. I was no longer the man he thought he had sent away. And from that place of loss, something far more dangerous than anger began to grow clarity. In the quiet that followed my disappearance, when no one was watching me anymore, memory became my sharpest companion. Long walks along the docks gave my thoughts room to stretch, and in that space, old instincts began to stir. I had built my life navigating risk, anticipating betrayal before it happened, preparing for storms when the sky still looked clear. That part of me had gone dormant during years of family comfort, but abandonment woke it up. As I replayed the past, one memory kept resurfacing, something I had done years earlier that felt insignificant at the time, almost paranoid, but now glowed with new meaning. It had been during a rapid expansion of the company, when success attracted attention that didn't always come with good intentions. Lawyers had warned me about vulnerabilities, about how quickly power could shift if trust was misplaced. I remembered sitting in a quiet office late one night, signing documents that bored everyone else. A contingency trust, they called it. Nothing dramatic, just a safety net. It didn't own the company outright, and it didn't interfere with daily operations. It existed to protect the bones of what I had built, the agreements, the leverage, the mechanisms that kept everything moving smoothly behind the scenes. At the time, my son had laughed about it. He said I worried too much, that family was enough protection. I hadn't argued. I rarely did with him back then. I simply made sure the trust was real, legal, and patient. And then I forgot about it, the way people forget about umbrellas when the weather stays good for too long. Sitting alone months later, with nothing but time and clarity, I realized that trust hadn't disappeared just because I had been removed. It was still there, waiting, untouched by betrayal, because it had been designed for exactly this kind of moment. The trust required proof of abandonment or coercion by next of kin to activate its deeper clauses. At the time, that condition had felt excessive. Now, it felt prophetic. I didn't rush. Revenge born from panic is sloppy, and I had already lost too much to be careless. Instead, I began collecting what the world had so generously given me, evidence. I documented every failed login, every rejected card, every unanswered call. I requested records from the cruise line, confirming that my ticket had been issued one way without disclosure. I retrieved public listings showing the sale of my house during the exact window I was unreachable. Each piece alone looked unfortunate. Together, they told a story no court could ignore. The act of gathering proof changed me. Pain stopped being something that happened to me and became something I could use. I felt my posture straighten, my thoughts slow and sharpen. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger clouds judgment. What I felt was precision, the calm certainty that comes when you realize the person who tried to bury you forgot to check if the ground was already reinforced. I contacted the lawyer quietly, the one who had helped me set the trust up years ago. He recognized my voice immediately, which surprised me more than it should have. People remember who stood by them when no one else did. I didn't explain everything at once. I didn't need to. I simply asked him to review the activation conditions again. There was a pause on the line, then a sigh that carried both sympathy and approval. "You were right to prepare," he said. "Most people never do. We worked carefully. Notices were sent. Clauses were triggered. Supplier agreements shifted hands without public drama. Oversight mechanisms tightened. None of it made headlines. That was the beauty of it. The company didn't collapse overnight. It began to strain quietly, invisibly, like a machine running without oil. My son would feel it long before he understood it. As weeks passed, I watched from a distance, not with pleasure, but with interest. I saw familiar names leave the company. I heard rumors of delayed payments, of partners suddenly asking questions no one wanted to answer. The trust wasn't punishing him. It was correcting the imbalance he had created. Power that had been taken without consent was being rerouted to a structure that couldn't be manipulated by charm or entitlement. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt. I had imagined revenge would feel like fire. Instead, it felt like order being restored, like putting something heavy down after carrying it too long. I wasn't trying to destroy my son. I was making sure he couldn't destroy what I had spent my life building. During that time, I learned something vital about myself. I wasn't fueled by bitterness. I was fueled by responsibility to the people who depended on that company, to the memory of my wife, to the younger version of myself who had worked too hard to be erased by convenience. The trust gave me leverage, yes, but it also gave me distance. I could act without stepping back into the role I had outgrown. When the first desperate call came, I didn't answer. Not because I enjoyed his panic, but because the work wasn't finished. He needed to feel the full weight of consequences before understanding could begin. Accountability has a language, and it speaks slowly. In rediscovering that safeguard, I rediscovered myself. Not the tired father eager to be loved, but the man who had survived worse storms than betrayal and learned how to build structures strong enough to outlast emotion. My son had believed removing me would end my influence. He never understood that real power, once built correctly, doesn't need its creator present to function. And as I stood by the water one evening, documents secured and the future quietly shifting, I realized something that made me smile. For the first time in months, being underestimated had become my greatest advantage. I didn't step in when the first cracks appeared. That was the hardest part, harder even than being abandoned. Every instinct I had, sharpened by decades of building and fixing, screamed at me to intervene. I knew where the problems were coming from. I knew which decisions were wrong, which egos were steering the company toward shallow water. But I also knew that stepping in too early would save my son from the very lesson he needed to learn. So I stayed silent, and I let time do what anger never could. From a distance, I watched the machine I had built begin to grind against itself. My son had always loved the visible parts of leadership, the meetings, the titles, the authority that came with a corner office. What he had never respected were the quiet systems that kept everything alive, relationships with suppliers built on trust, long-term contracts negotiated patiently, employees whose loyalty came from being treated like people rather than costs. Without me smoothing those edges, he replaced understanding with pressure. He demanded faster results, cheaper solutions, louder assurances. The company obeyed at first, as systems often do when abused. Then it began to resist. Small delays became noticeable. Payments that had always been punctual arrived late. Partners started asking for written guarantees instead of relying on verbal agreements. Long-standing suppliers, people who had once taken my calls at midnight, stopped answering his. None of it seemed catastrophic at first. That's how collapse begins, quietly, politely, in ways easy to dismiss. My son dismissed them all. He believed problems were a sign of bad luck, not bad leadership. He blamed market conditions, regulations, employees who didn't appreciate opportunity. He hired consultants who spoke in expensive language, but never addressed the core issue: trust had been broken. And trust is not something you can bully into existence. Watching him struggle was painful, not because I wanted to protect him, but because I recognized my own mistakes in his impatience. The difference was that I had learned from mine. He hadn't yet. Through the trust, the company was no longer allowed to bleed quietly. Oversight forced transparency. Reports exposed decisions that relied on short-term optics instead of long-term stability. My son felt watched, questioned, constrained. To him, it felt like sabotage. To the structure I had put in place, it was correction. A system correcting a deviation from its original purpose. There were nights I sat by the water and asked myself if I had gone too far. After all, this was still my child. But then I remembered the one-way ticket. The planning. The assumption that I would simply vanish. Consequences, I reminded myself, are not cruelty. They are truth arriving late. As the months passed, pressure mounted. Investors grew nervous. Employees sensed instability and began to leave, not in dramatic exits, but in quiet resignations that hurt far more. Talent is loyal to vision, not authority, and my son had replaced vision with control. Every departure weakened him further. Still, I did nothing. Silence became my discipline. The moment I knew the lesson had fully ripened came not from numbers, but from behavior. He stopped boasting. He stopped blaming everyone else. He started asking questions, real ones, the kind that don't assume you already know the answer. That's when fear turned into humility, and humility, if it's genuine, can be shaped into wisdom. The call finally came on a rainy afternoon. His voice was unrecognizable. No confidence, no charm, just exhaustion and disbelief. He didn't accuse me. He didn't argue. He asked how to fix it. That question mattered more than any apology could have. It told me he was finally ready to understand what he had done, not just to me, but to everything he touched. Even then, I didn't rush back. I explained, calmly, what had gone wrong, not in emotional terms, but in structural ones. I spoke about relationships neglected, safeguards ignored, power misused. I let him see the company the way I had always seen it, not as a trophy, but as a responsibility. Listening to him absorb that truth was harder than confronting him in anger would have been. Growth is uncomfortable. That's how you know it's real. What my son never fully realized was that his downfall wasn't engineered by me. I didn't pull strings to humiliate him or orchestrate his pain. I simply removed myself and allowed his own choices to echo without interference. He had built his own trap. I just refused to dismantle it for him. In waiting, I reclaimed something important. Patience returned to me, not as resignation, but as strength. I learned that sometimes the most powerful act of revenge is restraint. Letting someone face the full weight of who they have become is far more transformative than any punishment you could design. When the dust began to settle, and the company stabilized under the trust's guidance, I felt no triumph, only clarity. My silence had not been weakness. It had been a mirror, held steady long enough for my son to finally see himself. They didn't come back with confidence. They came back fractured, stripped of the certainty that had once made them cruel. The first message arrived late at night, careful and overly polite, as if they were writing to a stranger whose mood they couldn't predict. It was my daughter-in-law. She said there had been misunderstandings, that things had spiraled, that family should talk. The words were chosen like stepping stones across deep water, each one placed to avoid blame. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed to hear the truth, and truth never arrives wrapped in excuses. The next call was from my son. His voice cracked before he finished saying my name. I almost didn't recognize him. The man who had once spoken over me now paused between sentences, as if afraid of choosing the wrong word. He said the company was failing. He said partners were leaving. He said he didn't understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Then, finally, he said what he had avoided for months: he needed me. Need is a powerful revealer. When people no longer want, but require, their masks slip. I let him talk. I let the silence stretch after each confession. In that space, he began filling the gaps himself, admitting things I hadn't asked about. He spoke of the cruise, of how it had been presented as a solution. He admitted they assumed I would settle somewhere warm, quiet, and out of the way. That I would be too embarrassed to come back. That time would do the rest. Hearing it out loud hurt more than discovering it on my own. Betrayal imagined is sharp, betrayal confirmed is heavy. Still, I didn't interrupt. I needed him to hear himself. When he finally stopped, breathless and ashamed, I told him where I was, and said he could come if he wanted to talk face to face. Not to negotiate, to talk. They arrived together 2 days later. I saw them before they saw me, standing awkwardly near the marina office, dressed well but worn thin by stress. My son's shoulders were slumped, his confidence drained. My daughter-in-law avoided my eyes. When they finally approached, there were no grand gestures, no rehearsed speeches, just discomfort, guilt, and fear. My son apologized first. Not the polished kind meant to end a conversation, but the clumsy kind that stumbles because it's new. He admitted they had planned it, admitted they were afraid I would never let go, that I would always be there, always a shadow over his authority. He said they thought removing me was the only way he could become his own man. That confession mattered. Not because it excused anything, but because it revealed the real wound. This wasn't just greed, it was insecurity dressed up as strategy. My daughter-in-law spoke next. She cried. She said she pushed for it, that she feared I would eventually take back control, that my presence made her feel like a guest in her own life. She said she didn't think it would go this far. They never do. I listened, not as a judge, but as a man deciding what kind of ending this story deserved. Revenge had already done its work. Power had shifted. Consequences had landed. What stood in front of me now was not arrogance, but regret. They begged me to come back, to fix things, to take control again, to save them from what they had unleashed. It would have been easy to say yes, familiar even, to return to the role of rescuer, to be needed, to feel important again. But that temptation was another test, and this time, I saw it clearly. I told them no, not cruelly, calmly. I explained that I would not reclaim the throne they had tried to bury me under, that the company no longer belonged to any one person's ego, including mine. The trust would remain in control. Oversight would stay. My son would not be removed completely, but he would not lead unchecked again. Authority would be earned back slowly, transparently, if at all. They looked stunned. They had expected punishment or forgiveness. What they hadn't expected was boundaries. I told them something else too. That reconciliation was possible, but restoration was not guaranteed. Trust, once broken deliberately, does not return on command. It returns through consistency, humility, and time. And time, unlike money or power, cannot be negotiated. My son cried then openly. Not because he was losing something material, but because he finally understood the cost of what he had tried to discard. I didn't comfort him the way I once would have. I let him sit with it. Growth needs space. When they left, they thanked me. Not for mercy, but for honesty. I watched them walk away together, smaller than when they arrived, and felt a strange peace settle in me. Revenge had not ended in destruction. It had ended in revelation. They had begged me back, yes, but not as a forgotten old man desperate for relevance. They begged me as someone they now understood they had wronged. And that difference changed everything. For the first time since the ship sailed away with my life packed into a suitcase, I felt something close to closure. Not because I had won, but because I had refused to lose myself again. I didn't return to the life they had taken from me, even when I was offered pieces of it back like apologies wrapped in paper. That choice surprised them more than any legal consequence ever could. They expected me to want my old office, my old house, my old authority. They didn't understand that those things belonged to a man who no longer existed. The months of silence, hunger, and clarity had reshaped me. I wasn't interested in reclaiming a throne built on fear of losing it again. Instead, I chose something quieter and far more permanent: control without attachment. The trust remained exactly where it was, above personal ambition, insulated from ego, designed to protect rather than dominate. It funded employee pensions that could never again be gambled away by insecurity. It created scholarships in my wife's name, turning memory into opportunity instead of grief. It guaranteed transparency not because people are bad, but because power without limits eventually makes them careless. I didn't do this to punish my son. I did it to ensure that no one, including me, could ever misuse what so many people depended on. My son stayed with the company, but not at the top. He learned the parts of the business he had once ignored: the quiet work, the unglamorous responsibility, the consequences of every decision rippling outward. Watching him struggle through that humility was difficult, but it was necessary. Authority that hasn't been earned twice is rarely respected once. Over time he changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but genuinely. He began to listen more than he spoke. He asked instead of assumed. That, more than any apology, told me he was learning. As for me, I built a life no one could exile me from again. I bought a modest home by the water, small enough to clean myself, large enough to breathe in. I worked when I wanted, rested when I needed, and answered only to my own sense of purpose. I spent mornings walking the docks, afternoons reading, evenings sharing meals with people who didn't know my RA and didn't care. They knew me by my habits, not my history. What I had once called revenge revealed itself as something else entirely. It wasn't about taking power back. It was about placing it where it couldn't hurt anyone again. True revenge isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It corrects imbalance and then steps aside. There were moments late at night when the old ache returned, when I wondered if things could have been different, if I had missed signs, if love should have been enough. Those thoughts no longer haunted me. They visited, then left. I had made peace with the fact that betrayal says more about the betrayer's fear than the betrayed's worth. My relationship with my son changed, but it didn't end. We spoke less often, but more honestly. There were no illusions left between us, and strangely, that made room for something real. He no longer saw me as a shadow over his life. I no longer saw him as a reflection of my success or failure. We became two men connected by blood, not bound by control. The greatest victory wasn't watching him lose what he tried to steal. It was realizing that he no longer had the power to define me by approval, rejection, or regret. I had stepped outside the cycle entirely. People often think revenge is about making someone feel the pain they caused you. That's a misunderstanding. Pain teaches very little. Consequence teaches everything. I didn't need my son to suffer endlessly. I needed him to understand. And more importantly, I needed to understand myself. The man who boarded that cruise believed love meant trust without boundaries. The man who stepped away from it all understood that boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are what make love safe. I was no longer angry. Anger had burned out, leaving behind something steadier. Dignity. The kind that doesn't demand recognition and doesn't disappear when ignored. I had lost everything visible and discovered something unmovable. When I stand by the water now and watch ships depart, I no longer feel fear. I know that no ticket, one way or otherwise, can remove me from my own life again. I belong to myself now, and that is a freedom no one can take. That was the final revenge, not his humiliation, not my restoration, but the quiet, undeniable proof that I had survived betrayal without becoming it.